Political campaigns are increasingly being funded by super PACs and nonprofit corporations. Now the question is all this spending just a form of free speech, or is it buying some kind of influence? Welcome to Talks on Law, at the cutting edge of law. I'm Suraj Patel, and with me today is Professor Richard Briffault of Columbia Law School, a leading expert in the field of money and politics. Welcome, Professor. It's great to have you today.
Great, glad to be here.
Why do we need to regulate money and politics in the first place? Why do we need to regulate how much a candidate can spend or receive?
Really, there are sort of two big ideas out there, I think, for why we have been regulating money and politics for a very long time. One has to do with the impact of money on an election, who's going to win, and the different stages, primaries and general elections, and how fair the electoral competition is amongst the candidates in terms of reaching out to the voters. And the second, and maybe even the bigger question, is what's the impact of the money that's funding the election on the government that happens after the election? To what extent are elected officials going to be particularly attentive to the interests of their donors and their financial backers when they're in the government? So those are really the two things.
In order to win an election, you need money.
You don't need to have the most money. It's probably good to put it on the table. You need to have enough money to get your message out. How much that is going to depend on whether you're running for city council or you're running for president, depending on the context, depending on other things. But you need to be able to get your message out, communicate with the voters.
And so how much money can a person raise? How much can he spend on an election?
Well, under our system, the Supreme Court has established this, there's no limits on how much you can spend. Supreme Court, we could talk more about this, but the Supreme Court has basically said that spending limits are unconstitutional because they limit the ability of not just candidates, but political parties and anybody who's interested in the election in getting out their arguments, their facts, their efforts to persuade other people. So the candidates can spend as much as they want. They can also raise as much as they want, but the one thing that the court has said is permissible and that federal law limits and most states limits is the amount of money a candidate can raise from any one particular donor. There's the concern that if you're totally dependent or you're getting a huge amount of money from one specific donor, you're going to be unduly grateful, for lack of a better word, to that person. So we do have the federal government, Congress, and most of the states have some limits on how much you can get from one person, but no limits as to how much you can raise altogether.
So the larger amount of money raised from a single person, the bigger the chances of quid pro quo.
Yeah, and it even goes beyond quid pro quo, because quid pro quo gives this element of there's a specific deal. I'll give you $100,000 if you will do ... I think this is more concerned of not the literal quid pro quo, but you'll be unduly attentive, unduly grateful that before you vote on something in that person's industry or field, you'll check with them. If that person has a particular something they want stopped or passed, you'll be very, very attentive. That thing could be something that's not even on the horizon, in the campaign, but comes up 2 years later. So quid pro quo, it's very specific. I think it's more like a metaphor. It's more like in the long run, there'll be this kind of back and forth, kind of reciprocal gratitude that we're concerned about.
Well, here's where I think it's interesting, is at that local level, at that smaller race. So smaller races, when we say that spending is a form of expression, when a group, an outside group, or a lobbyist group, say from the tobacco industry or solar power industry or whatever, spends on behalf of a candidate or contributes to a candidate somewhere, is that really a form of expression?
Well, I like to think of it two ways. One is the candidate spending. It's not. I wouldn't say that money itself is speech, but in our large, complicated, expensive society, you need to spend money to get your speech out. And that's how I put it. I mean, people have often said the Supreme Court said money is speech. I think that's a little unfair. I think what they've said is you need to be able to spend money to get your message out. And that's how I see it, is that it's expensive to buy airtime, it's expensive to travel, it's expensive to get up a computer operation, it's expensive to get out the vote drive. Elections cost money. And of course, when there are supportive groups, a lot of the time what they are paying for is TV ads. The TV ads are speech. We may not think a lot of what they're saying, but the TV ads, the radio ads, the messages that they're sending out, the robocalls, they're actually saying something.
And so when the supportive group spends to get a message out, the speech we're talking about is their right to get their message out on behalf of a candidate.
Right, right.
And does that outside group talk or work directly with the candidate on what they can advertise?
They're not supposed to. So this gets into the idea that we have this really kind of odd system where the Supreme Court has upheld limits on how much any individual or group or organization can give to a candidate, but has not upheld spending limits. Has said that anybody can spend as much as they want. So we've created a system in which groups that, you could, once you hit your ceiling on what you could give to a candidate, people say max out. Once you hit the maximum you can give to a candidate, you still have money, you still want to support the candidate, what do? You spend, quote unquote, independently. The legal term is independent spending. The trick is, what do we mean by independent?
So I'm a candidate. I need to raise money. The Supreme Court has now created a system wherein I can't receive all the money I need to get my message heard if I can raise only at, say, $3,000 a pop.
That's not completely true. I mean, some candidates have done very well raising large amounts of money from relatively small donations. Ron Paul in 2012, I think, when he ran, he raised a lot of money, relatively small amounts of money. Barack Obama in 2008, he got a lot of big donations, but he got a very large amount of small donations. Bernie Sanders has raised a lot of money, relatively small donations, to making him competitive.
But to keep up and compete, what do I do? What are my other options? Do I form an outside committee?
Right.
I have my friends form an outside committee. Is this what we're talking about when we say super PACs?
You have your friends, right? So the super PAC, super. We'll tell you what makes it super in a second. I'll tell you. PAC stands for Political Action Committee. That dates back to the 1940s when Congress imposed limits on the ability of labor unions to participate in election campaigns. And so what the leading labor union at the time, the CIO, came up with was the idea of, we won't spend our union treasury money. What we'll do is we'll contact all of our members, and we'll let each of our members to kick in some money to a separate fund called the Political Action Committee. And instead of using union treasury funds, individual members will be pushed to make contributions into the fund, and we'll use that fund. So that is what a PAC is. It mostly came up in the context of unions and corporations initially. Federal law has for a long time prohibited corporations from actually contributing directly to candidates, and since the 40s it's prohibited unions.
Wait a minute, but I thought that is no longer the case.
That law is still in the books. The prohibition on corporations and unions giving directly to candidates and parties is still law. But what they came up with, and what Congress upheld, and Congress legalized ultimately, and the Supreme Court has upheld, is the idea that the corporation can't put its treasury funds in. It take from its own treasury. But the corporation can solicit its officers, directors, and shareholders. A union can solicit its members and ask them to make a contribution to a separate fund called the PAC. The PAC can make contributions to candidates.
And the PAC can make contributions to candidates in unlimited amounts?
No, the PAC's contributions to candidates are limited.